Most diabolical fantasy villains in the world, Fantasy Brains!
What's up, Brainiacs? Welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Brains podcast. And we are so excited to bring you episode 2 of our 32-team NFL series, where we are going to be doing a deep dive into each NFL team for the 2025 season on a fantasy football scale. So we're going to be doing individual player projections, looking at the depth chart changes from last year to this year, looking at some strength of schedule, some playoff weather when it comes to those fantasy football playoffs, and even some sexy storylines. And it's all going to be, as you can see on your right here, the fantasy football whiteboard. So as we get through this video, we're going to be filling out the entire whiteboard, as there is a lot to talk about today. We are going to be covering the Baltimore Ravens as our second team. We covered the Steelers in our last one, which was definitely a little bit more of a polarizing option. Today, we're going with a lot more of a solidified team with the Baltimore Ravens, less changes, high-powered offense, complete different scale. Before we get started, make sure to check out all of the Leather Brains content on YouTube, Spotify, Twitter, TikTok, at Leather Brains. We got a ton of great content flowing around there. The Leather Brains guys have been putting out a ton of great stuff every Tuesday, going live at around 6:30 or 7:30 Eastern. It changes week to week. But again, make sure to check out all those socials for the rest of our content, and definitely go back and check out that Steelers video, and so you can see what I predicted for Aaron Rodgers to have for this upcoming season. But like I said, we're going to get right into it with the Baltimore Ravens. And this is going to be a really fun team to talk about, but also let's be real here. There isn't that much to talk about because they aren't very different from last year. When we look at the depth chart changes, how they look in scale to how they looked last year. Lamar Jackson is still the quarterback of this team. Some people say he should have won MVP. I'm one of those people. He ends up being the all-pro first-team quarterback, so I guess you could say that we take that. But he had a terrific season last year, both in the air and on the ground. This is a top-5 offense, and we are projecting it to be another top-5 offense this year. Looking at the running back room, again, very similar to what it was last year. We have Derrick Henry leading the pack. We got Justice Hill, who might not be as relevant from a fantasy perspective, but definitely provides some great real-life value to this Ravens team, especially as a third down back, as a change of pace back from, the big 6'4" Derrick Henry running down your throat on every single defense that they play. And then a little bit different, they have Keaton Mitchell coming back from injury, who most people won't even remember because last year he didn't do anything. But 2 years ago, he had a very electric second half of his rookie season before Derrick Henry got into the fold and signed that offseason. So I don't really think Mitchell's going to have much of a role. But if we are to see an injury from Derrick Henry this season, I think Mitchell would be the guy to get those early down snaps, those first and second down carries over Justice Hill. And Justice Hill would play more of his third down role in this offense like he always has. Looking at the receiver room, got Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, who is fresh off a 3-year extension, so he is locked and loaded, ready to go. And then the wide receiver 3 is DeAndre Hopkins. He's been kind of getting passed around. It kind of seems like he's having a little bit of a Julio Jones arc to end his career, but don't expect too many big games out of Hopkins. I think he's just, at this point, trying to get his ring. And then on the tight ends, you got Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely, a great tight end tandem. O-line and the defense are looking very similar as they were last year. But let's get right into the meat of this episode here, and that is the fantasy football forecast. Because again, it's all about projections. It's all about how do we see these players on the Ravens in comparison to where they're being drafted. So Charlie and I, like we mentioned in last video, statted out every single NFL team. We ranked every single player based on target shares, based on percentages, and so it all lined up. So we had all of that mathematically and analytically, messed around with it a little bit based off our own opinions. Obviously, you're not all going to go statistical, but it was interesting to see how some of these players really lined up versus, where they're actually being drafted. So looking at some of the individual player projections, let's start out with Lamar Jackson. We're projecting him to be the quarterback 2 on the season, just behind Josh Allen. He's getting drafted as a quarterback 2, but I think when you're talking about him and Josh Allen, it's 1A, 1B. Either one of them could finish over the other. And I think Lamar actually might be a little bit better this year, even though I have him statistically as the quarterback 2. I just like his weapons a little bit more, whereas Josh Allen relied on a lot more rushing touchdowns last year with a whopping 15. I think Lamar could be in for another monster year. I'm projecting him to have about 3,900 passing yards and 31 passing touchdowns. and then another 800 rushing yards and 5 rushing touchdowns. He's a dual threat quarterback. He is elite. He's one of those quarterbacks that I'd be willing to really pull the trigger on early in fantasy. I think when you're talking about quarterbacks, I think there's a ton of talent, especially when you're playing in a redraft league where, it's 10 to 12 people in the league and you're only starting one quarterback. Most of the time, I'd say hold off on quarterback. You can get a value such as a Dak Prescott or a Brock Purdy or a Justin Herbert or a Tua, whatever it might be, Caleb Williams. I think when you're taking Lamar earlier in the third, fourth, fifth round, whatever it might be in your drafts, I think that pick is worth it because he provides you that weekly upside. He can give you spike weeks. He can go out there and score 35 points on a weekly basis because of his ability to go out there and rush for 80 yards and a touchdown while also throwing for, 250 yards and 2 more touchdowns. So I think with Lamar and then combined with that, they improved their defense even more this offseason. Lamar's just going to have a lot of opportunities on the offensive side of the ball. And even if they're winning games, Lamar is still going to be running the ball. We saw what he was able to do in week, I believe it was 16 last year on Christmas against the Texans, where they blew him out 30-2. But Lamar still had a great fantasy performance, still putting together a ton of rushing yards, multiple rushing touchdowns. So Lamar, he's as safe as you can get. And I think that him and, like I said, Josh Allen are by far and away the 2 best quarterbacks in fantasy football this year. Moving on to Derrick Henry. We have him projected out as the running back 8 on the season. He is going as the RB6, which was a little bit higher than I anticipated, when I was first writing down, these ADPs and these notes. But we have him predicted for about 1,450 rushing yards and 13 touchdowns. Now, that seems like a lot, but this is a guy that has been able to stay healthy his entire career. He is in his 30s now, which it definitely is concerning. Maybe I'm the idiot that's still continuing to believe that he's going to be able to stay healthy when every other running back starts to hit that major decline once they're 28, 29, 30, whereas Derrick Henry's in his 30s and he's still, moving forward like he never lost a step. So with Henry, we know what we get out of him. He does profile as a better player in a half-point PPR or a standard league with no points per reception. If you're in a full-point PPR, he's still great. Everything in the scale is based off full point PPR, so we still do have him as the RB8, but he's really not going to provide much receiving upside. We only have him here getting about 15 catches on the season for about 150 yards, so very lackluster receiving performance from Henry because most likely you're only going to see him catch screen passes. And like I mentioned earlier, Justice Hill is going to figure in on those 2-minute drives to end the half. If they're coming back in a game, you're really going to see Hill take over that snap share. And I think that's part of the way that the Ravens keep Henry fresh is by not keeping him on the field 100% of the time. But obviously, when he's on the field, every week he gives you the potential to go off for 30 points. He can break any run. And I think if you're looking at a best ball formatted league, a lot of people are very indifferent about him this year, saying, he's an okay pick at the beginning of the second round. I love the pick because Derrick Henry in December is just a different breed. He has always just been so great. He gets better in December and he always stays healthy during that time. So I think if you're looking for a player who's going to get you points down the line, I like Derrick Henry. I think he's always a great option. I talked about Justice Hill. We don't even really need to stat him out here just because he's not much of a fantasy relevant player in your redraft league. So we have him around the running back 50 range, but he's never going to be a guy that you're excited to draft or you're going to draft. He could be on some, deep end dynasty league teams, but I think his value is capped with Henry at the lead of this offense. But if Henry is to go down, that's where it starts to get interesting with where do we see the difference between him and Keaton Mitchell in terms of that snap share? Do we see 50-50? Do we see 60-40 in terms of, or in favor of Justice Hill? Again, I don't think Henry's going to go down, so it's not something that we're going to have to worry about, but injuries happen all the time. So that is something with Derrick Henry. If you're looking for the handcuff, I think Mitchell is actually the better handcuff to repeat the rushing production, whereas Hill, I think, would more stay in that third down role. Looking at the receiving room, again, there's really only 2 guys that we really want to focus on here. DeAndre Hopkins is undraftable. We have him ranked as our receiver 115. He might put together 1 to 2 decent performances on the season, but we expect this Ravens team to be running a lot of 2 tight end sets with Andrews and Likely. And so with that, combined with a high rushing volume in this offense, there's no reason for Hopkins to be drafted. But Zay Flowers is a player that I am very, very high on when I statted out this entire team. I have him as the receiver 15 on the season. I have him going for about 85 catches for 1,100 yards and 6 touchdowns. And right now, he's going as the receiver 30. So Zay Flowers, who's a guy where last year he finished in the early 20s on the season, and it was his second year, kind of had some up and down weeks. It's where we saw a lot of inconsistency, something that I'll get to with the storylines later in the episode. But he gave a lot better value in a best ball league as opposed to a redraft, where in redraft, you didn't really know whether or not it was a good idea to start him. I think this year it could be a little bit different. I think they could rely on him a lot more. I think they could get him a lot of balls behind the line of scrimmage, which I know that they've done that in these past 2 years, but I think that they're going to rely on him even more this year just because he's proven to be a good asset in this offense and to be an explosive asset. When you look at Andrews and you look at Likely, these are great targets to throw to for Lamar, but they're not the small, gadgety player like Zay Flowers is. I am curious to see if we do see a little bit better upside and more positive regression when it comes to the deep passes for Flowers, because I think he's a fine, deep threat, but he just doesn't have that role in the offense. They profile him more as a intermediate and short route player and Bateman as the deep threat. But I think Flowers could be used in a lot better ways. And so I think looking at him, ADP of wide receiver 30 is absolutely way too low for a receiver 1 on a great offense like this. You have to look, and what we did when we're projecting these numbers is looking at how many yards are the Ravens actually going to throw for this year. And if you're projecting Lamar Jackson to be a top 2 fantasy quarterback, to be an MVP candidate, he has to throw the ball to somebody. And Zay Flowers is the receiver 1 on this offense. I just think ADP wide receiver 30 is just way too low for the upside that he has. So I think that Zay Flowers is a definite smash at his current ADP. I would definitely try to get a lot of shares of him because the volume will be there. And when you talk about touchdowns and when you talk about big plays, those are things that have a lot of variation from year to year. But the volume is something that if you have volume, it just gives you better odds to get those higher end plays and more touchdowns. So I think Flowers is going to be a player that'll be utilized a lot this year. And, looking at his partner in crime with Rashad Bateman here, I think Bateman is a good real life player. He had some decent fantasy weeks last year. We have him here at the receiver 43. So we're also, again, a little bit higher on him than the ADP is. He's being drafted right now as the receiver 56, which, again, I think is way too low. When you're talking about the receiver 2 on this Ravens offense, fresh off a contract extension, former first-round pick, I just think if you're predicting that Lamar Jackson's going to have a great year, then why won't Rashad Bateman at least be a receiver 4? Somebody that you can play on your bench if the Ravens are playing the Bengals and it might be a shootout of a game. Bateman's never going to be a guy that you're going to really be relying on a week-to-week basis, but he does provide high weekly upside. So I think in best ball, he does have a lot of value and could be a candidate to catch, 6 to 7 touchdowns. We have him statted out at 61 catches, 7 touchdowns, and 800 yards. So I have him going for a pretty good season and catching more touchdowns than Zay Flowers is this season. So I like Bateman a lot. I think he's a very solid option this year in fantasy for best ball, but in redraft as a bench option, especially if you have Lamar and you want to get that stack going. Looking at the tight end room, I think this is the biggest question of the offense. Where do Andrews and Likely sit? Andrews is coming off the drop of the century last year where it, basically ended their season. Even if, one play doesn't make the entire game, that is what everybody is going to remember Mark Andrews for. Isaiah Likely last year in week 1 has this massive game where he has 8 catches, 100 yards, 2 touchdowns, and everyone's like, Isaiah Likely is going to be the tight end 1 in this offense. Second half of the season, Mark Andrews comes back and is a top 10 tight end like we've always known him. So right now, we have Mark Andrews statted in as a tight end 7. I have him going for 68 catches, 785 yards, and 9.5 touchdowns. So I think touchdowns is where he really could eat this year. The Ravens are going to score a lot of points. I said it earlier. Lamar Jackson, I have him predicted to throw 32 touchdowns. So if Lamar is throwing 32 touchdowns, I think Mark Andrews is easily the number 1 red zone threat in this offense. And I think if you really take away I know it's hard to take it away, but if you look at what he did the first half of the season versus the second half of the season, his second half of the season was much improved. It looked like he was going through some stuff in the first half, whether it's injury, whether it's just not getting back on the field for the season. I'm not exactly sure, but I think Andrews could be in a great year for tight end. He's being drafted as a tight end 8. We got him tight end 7. So I think you can lock Andrews in as a definite top 10 tight end, a talented player in a good offense. I think with Isaiah Likely, we're a little bit lower on him. We got him at tight end 21. He's being drafted as tight end 16. Now, we have him predicted for 55 catches, 509 yards, and 5.5 touchdowns, which still seems pretty good and seems a little low for the tight end, 21. But I think part of the reason why people are drafting him as the tight end 16 is because it's baked into the price that if Mark Andrews does go down and Likely is the number 1 tight end in this offense, he is top 5 tight end potential in fantasy. He's a talented player. He's great after the catch. And I keep saying it, but if you're in a good offense, it's going to score. You're going to score more touchdowns. You're going to have more opportunities. And you know that the attention's never going to be on him. The attention's always going to be on the running game with Lamar and Henry. So I think that Likely has a lot of upside, especially in best ball, if Mark Andrews is to go down. In redraft, I think he's okay, but I really wouldn't be investing in him as any type of player that you're going to be starting on a weekly basis. So that'll wrap up the fantasy football forecast, but let's get into the strength of schedule and the playoff games. So quarterback, Lamar is going to face the 21st ranked schedule. So number 1 is going to be the easiest. 32 is going to be the hardest. So he has the 21st in terms of strength of schedule for quarterbacks. I'm not worried. We talked about it. Lamar Jackson, it doesn't matter who he's playing. You're going to start him every week. He has the upside to go off against any team, any defense, but maybe that's why you might prefer Josh Allen over him, because I haven't done the Bills yet, but if the Bills do have an easier strength of schedule, let's say at the 12, then you might prefer him just with a little bit of an easier schedule. Now, I would keep this in mind that these strength of schedules are all based off last year, based off how teams were, and teams change from year to year a lot. So none of this is necessarily 100% accurate, but it just gives us a little bit of a better picture of what it could look like based on their schedule this season, based off how those teams performed last year against the positions. Running back, you're looking at the 11th best schedule for Derrick Henry and Justice Hill. I think this is great. Like I said, Henry, I think he's a guy that you can trust every week. He's been great every season. And if he has a top, third of the league schedule, there's no reason why he's not going to have some boom weeks, especially in the middle of the season when you're trying to get those wins to make it to your fantasy playoffs. So I think 11th easiest, that's going to be the best schedule for any of these Ravens position groups, and why I think they could rely a little bit more on the run this year, maybe that even more than they did last year. Looking at receiver, it's only going to be a little bit behind running back, but it's the 13th easiest. So pretty much in the league average. I think this is a great sign for Zay Flowers. Now, it is going to be interesting to see how teams attack the Ravens receivers. Is it going to be manning your cornerback 1 against Zay Flowers and corner 2 against Bateman? Are you just going to run, your sides, and are Flowers and Bateman going to switch sides? I personally think that nobody's going to shadow Zay Flowers. He's not a big enough threat for that. So I think that when you look at how Bateman and Flowers complement each other, that's where you're going to be looking at those team-specific matchups. Who are they playing? What's the zone scheme? And that's really going to define how they're going to perform on a weekly basis. Does this team blitz a lot? Or are you going to see a lot more man coverage? Because that will help Bateman a lot. Whereas the zone, I think, will help Flowers and get a lot more screen passes and just gadget plays. Tight end, they have a 25th ranked schedule. So I think, this is tough for Andrews and Likely, but I think for tight ends, it is the least important just because you have so much variance on who's going to be guarding the tight end, especially with 2 different tight ends. It could be a linebacker, could be a safety, could be a nickel corner. So I wouldn't buy too much into that. That's really not going to scare me much from drafting either of these guys. And then looking at their playoff schedule, week 15, 16, 17, you have week 15 at the Bengals, which is just going to be, we know how these Bengals-Ravens games always go. It's going to be a shootout. That's looking great for the first round of your fantasy playoffs. Week 16 at home against the Patriots, who also profile to be a potential playoff team and have something to play for. And then you have week 17 in Green Bay, which is going to be a huge game for both teams and definitely a tough game for the Ravens. So I think when we're looking at this playoff schedule, it's 3 games where I know that at least 2 of them look like they're going to be great games. Maybe you could say that they are going to beat down on the Pats, but I think all 3 of these games could be closer games than people think, which are good for the overall fantasy landscape of this Ravens team. It means that we're not going to see a blowout come third quarter and that Lamar's going to be off the field and Henry's not going to be getting any more carries. So I think it's looking great. These are going to be close games, really good for players like Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews, where we can get into some of the storylines now. I think the biggest storyline is with Zay Flowers. Are we going to see the same week-to-week inconsistencies that we saw last year? Zay Flowers had 6 games with 7 or less points. So in 6 games last season, which is a third of your fantasy season, he gave you a dud. He was absolutely terrible. But then he had 5 games with 20-plus points, including one 30-point bomb. So you have 1/3 of the games he's average, 1/3 of the games he's below average, and 1/3 of the games he's above average. So he was super inconsistent on a week-to-week basis last year. And we heard Greg Roman, the Ravens OC, kind of talking about, what's it going to look like on, for Zay Flowers here. And they said they want to get him more opportunities. And I think I said Greg Roman, I meant Todd Monken, but Greg Roman was their old offensive coordinator. But I think with Zay Flowers, you're just hoping for a little bit more week-to-week consistency, especially on those dud weeks. Because if he can get even just 2 more receptions per week on those dud weeks, that can bring him to at least a 10-point performance. And then you're not sitting there saying, oh, I lost my week because Zay Flowers put up 5 points. And instead it's, okay, at worst, he gives me 9 to 10, and he still has the boom potential to go out for 20 plus. So I think that's a big storyline for this team. And then I think the other one, the obvious one is, is Isaiah likely going to take over the Mark Andrews tight end 1 role? The one thing that we haven't really mentioned about this is Mark Andrews is on a contract year, and it doesn't seem like they want to really bring him back. I think they're happy with what they have with Likely, and I think bringing in Mark Andrews on a big contract is not where they want to spend their money when they're already allocating a ton of money to other positions. So I think that this could be a year where they actually utilize Mark Andrews a lot, but Isaiah Likely is going to be in the fold as well, like we were predicting. And Harbaugh said he expects Likely to have a great year. Now, you can only take that with a grain of salt because not everyone can have a great year. But I do think we could see some weeks with Likely being the better option, some weeks with Andrews being the better option. But I do like Andrews on a season-long basis just because he's the vet, he's the better player, he's more proven. And, him and Lamar have been playing together for a lot longer than Lamar and Likely have. So I think Likely is a great player to stash away for Dynasty right now because Andrews is probably off this team after this year. But I think for redraft and for best ball purposes, Andrews is obviously the better option. But that'll cap off this episode 2 of the Fantasy Football 32 team series. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. We're going to be covering the rest of the AFC North, the Browns and the Bengals in our next 2 episodes. And then we're just going to keep doing division after division. Let us know in the comments what other stuff you'd like to see us talk about in these videos, whether it's more stuff from last year's statistics, whether it's trying to predict more game by game, whether it's looking at bye weeks, whatever it might be. Let us know in the comments what you want to see more of. And again, make sure to check out all of our other content on YouTube, on Spotify, TikTok, X, Instagram, all the above at Leatherbrains. And definitely make sure to hit the subscribe button on YouTube and hit that notifications button so you know when we're putting out a new video. Thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.
3, 2, 1.
Got a blast!
Thanks for checking out the Fantasy Brains. Don't miss next week's episode, Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. See you next week, Brainiacs.